Welcome to Dark Outdoors. This is Chester Moore, and I have my good friend Lyle Blackburn back on the program. And Lyle has a brand new book out about the Lake Worth monster. Welcome to the program, Lyle.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You know, you and I growing up around the same time there, the Lake Worth monster was kind of something that echoed from just the recent past. You know what I mean? It was something that was out there, and it was always sort of tied in with like the Bigfoot phenomenon, of course. And I always thought it was really interesting. I remember going out to Lake Worth one time and just looking out around the natural area there and just thinking, this is really crazy because the Lake Worth monster case isn't just a Bigfoot case, is it?
No, that's the strange part. It's sort of a what is it on top of a did people really see something? So it has
Yeah,
a lot of layers to it, and it's something that it's a little unexpected now because Lake Worth is so close to Fort Worth, and
sure.
Fort Worth, Dallas has expanded so much that, to imagine back in 1969 that something could have been running amok out there
Yeah.
in what was then a wooded area is really just stuck with people as a legend, lore, or
Hmm.
cryptozoology.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, what inspired you particularly to tackle? Because when you do a book on anything, it's like an ultra deep dive. You know, you go way into the minutia of it, which makes it so fascinating. So, what made you want to take that journey into the Lake Worth monster case?
Well, it was sort of a confluence of several things. Number one, Craig Woolheater has been Craig, known for Texas Bigfoot research, has just really wanted me to write a book on that for a long time. But there just, to me, wasn't enough to it. I mean, there's some
Hmm.
intriguing things, but it wasn't like sightings went on for years and years, and
Hmm.
a movie wasn't made or anything. So I always thought, well, as to be enough for a book, there's just not enough there. But oftentimes, as these things work with what we do and research and meeting people,
Hmm.
and over the years you get trickles of stuff, and then
Yeah.
you may find something that hasn't been publicized. So it was sort of a just all came together where I got some stuff and interviewed somebody that was pertinent to the case, and all that just came together. And I thought, okay, now I've got it. Now I've got something to offer up and above, what people would normally know. And then I set out to like do the deep dive.
So, if my memory serves me correct, it was a hot summer night in 1969, and a lady claims that she was attacked by a creature.
Right, July 10th, 1969,
Hmm.
summer of love in California,
Mm,
summer of monsters in Texas,
there we go.
which is the only way you and I would have it. But
Absolutely.
um, yeah, so basically, and this is something I've put together the complete story.
Hmm.
Um, so what happened was a couple was
Hmm.
out at Lake Worth, and at the time it was kind of a lovers lane hangout north of Fort
Hmm.
Worth, near a little place called Greer Island. That was the landmark, and it was a little
Hmm.
island out there.
Hmm.
Um, this The couple was John and Linda Reichert, and John went out there to fish because he heard the fishing was good, so he was fishing. And Linda, his wife, thought it was kind of spooky out there at night, so she just stayed up in the car and I guess had some
Hmm.
way to read a book and was sitting there. And there was a couple other cars parked out there as well with couples in them doing
Hmm.
couple things or listening to the radio or whatever. And all of a sudden, John was fishing and he heard Linda scream,
Okay.
and he looked around. And he saw like this figure of something that had jumped
Hmm.
on the hood of the car and then come down on the side and was just hunched over the open window. And she's screaming, and so he throws a fishing pole and runs up there and confronted what he described as a upright thing standing on two legs covered in
Hmm.
whitish hair. He said it looked like, quote unquote, a goat man. It had
Hmm.
horns and um, just that sort of a description. And he tussled with it for a moment, and it kind of fell back from the car. He jumped in,
Mhm.
started up, they drove away. Um, and they ended up driving up to this little cafe, which was sort of the only thing open out there back in those
Mhm.
days and at that time.
Mhm.
Went in there and called the police, who came down to investigate this situation. The other couples that were parked down there had driven up also they had seen this and drove up to the
Mhm.
cafe. And the police proceeded to sort of, do what they could to investigate. Followed John back to the location. They saw a big scratch on the side of their car, which he's
Mhm.
like, this thing did this. Well,
Mhm.
that was covered in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram newspaper. So that morning of July 10th, because this was late at night, so the next day it comes out in the paper, written by Jim Mars, a journalist, who's writing for the paper, about this sort of scaly, fishy goat man monster thing that attacked this couple. And so
Mhm.
right off the bat, it was just public news. And of course, in
Mhm.
those days, everybody read the newspaper. So
Yeah, it was a big deal. People
yeah,
listening need to realize this. If you were in a Fort Worth Star Telegram, I mean, 75% of the people are reading that thing the next morning.
yeah. So it immediately brought all this
Mhm.
attention to it. And that essentially set off just a huge public interest in
Mhm.
this. And by later that evening, there
Mhm.
were numerous 40, 50 people down there, just trying to see what they could see. This included Fort Worth police officers,
Mhm.
all sorts of people who were sort of you know, partying at Lake Worth, and people wanting to see a monster. And that evening, the bystanders were just hanging out, and all of a sudden, they hear some ruckus and they see a figure run up on top of this ridge that was kind of a
Mhm.
cliff and a meadow there right
Mhm.
across from Greer Island. And they saw what they claimed was some sort of 7 foot tall creature covered in
Mhm.
white hair or something like
Mhm.
that. It it ended up grabbing a tire with a wheel and hurling it across the field out there above by the the bystanders.
Mhm.
And that freaked everybody out, and they all just sort of ran in every direction. And one guy wrecked his car into a tree trying to escape, and just crazy stuff. And of course, the next day that was printed in the newspaper, which added more fuel to the fire. And so
Mhm.
that those events and the newspaper coverage, set off just a story about this and subsequent sightings that happened over the next year or so, that made this case memorable. Many people remember it.
What were the police? What was their immediate sort of take on this?
Well, yeah, of course they get a call like that and they're
Yeah.
dubious. I'm sure they're
Yeah.
thinking people are parking out at Lake Worth, they're
Mhm.
drinking, who knows what. But for two reasons, they kind of thought, well, maybe there's something to it. Number one,
Mhm.
because the Reichards were so freaked out and so distraught
Mhm.
about what
Mhm.
happened. They knew something happened to them, something scary. And also because the police had been getting reports for several months prior of people
Hmm.
claiming to have seen some kind of strange creature down there. So this wasn't the
Mhm.
first they had heard of it, but this was
Ah.
the first time that, like, an incident happened. So, of course, when they followed the Reichards down to Greer Island, they didn't see the creature, undoubtedly, and
Mhm.
um, everything. So the police, then thought, well, something did happen, but it was probably hoaxers or somebody's playing a prank, or
Mhm.
um, and then a few days later, some of the wildlife officials down there said, well, there's a bobcat loose in the park. It's probably a bobcat that,
Okay.
and that's not what John Reichert described. And here's the thing that I add to my book. Now, John
Mhm.
Reichert has passed away
Mhm.
uh, a while back, and he was like his name was in the paper. I mean,
Yeah.
it was crazy. They even gave his address. I mean, it's really
Oh,
weird.
wonderful.
Yeah, back then. So I never spoke to him, but I did get in contact with his son, Eric.
Hmm.
And Eric had somehow he knew the story and had somehow realized that it had become something that's shared on the internet. And when I
Hmm.
spoke to him, he's like, "Oh yeah, I remember my dad talking about this. He did a
Hmm.
drawing, which I saw. He drew a sketch of the
Hmm.
creature as best he
Hmm.
could." And so by talking to Eric, that's when I really pieced together everything that wasn't in the newspaper because he remembered the story and he filled in the gaps and everything else. So that was one of those catalysts that I thought, okay, now I've got some inside information that kicks this up a notch.
Yeah, I mean, it talks about the attack on her. What was the Mrs. What was Mrs. Reichert's? What was her take on this? Did they like interrogate her about this, or did she kind of clam up?
Well, the police, when they showed up to that cafe, they,
Hmm.
saw both of them and presumably they both, recounted what had happened to
Hmm.
the police. Um, and then she wasn't quoted or anything in the paper. Like John
Hmm.
did most of the talking.
Yeah,
Back then, 69, it was always like Miss Reichert. It was always the guy. And the
yeah,
woman
yeah.
was sort
Culture
of
is
like,
different. Yeah.
yeah, it's like, they didn't even mention her name. The reason I know her name, no
Hmm.
one knows this until now, is because I talked to their son. And so he said his mom it just freaked his mom out. And she just, she obviously corroborated what story that his father told. So he's like, this happened. And the thing is we can probably go into this a little more. The way John described it was very much like a goat man, which gets into sort of, if you want to get cryptozoology or urban legend,
Hmm.
goat men is another category of sort of this creatures that may or may not exist. They're usually
Yeah.
associated with ridges and that being separate from a Bigfoot, which is how
Hmm.
subsequent people began to describe it. They never really said it had horns. It was just described as this big, upright, hairy, ape-like thing covered in white hair.
Yeah, I mean, as a kid, I remember first. We're going to get into this. There's a photo that was associated with the Lake Worth monster, and a white thing, and I kind of thought, white Bigfoot. And I think even for people listening that may be into cryptozoology, I think if people are even loosely into this topic, they might be able to accept Bigfoot. They go, okay, well, there's enough evidence, even back to First Nations, but a goat man? I mean, what in the heck? But this is what the evidence went toward. Was this goat thing? But I got to go to this photo. What was the photo taken? I mean, there's a very famous photo out there. How was that taken? That there was this photo of the alleged Lake Worth monster.
Well, that was taken on November 19th,
Hmm.
1969. So this, the timeline was,
Hmm.
July when these first encounters, and then there had been a lot of
Hmm.
activity prior to
Hmm.
that. Um, and then this gentleman named Alan Plaster was driving along Shoreline Road, which ran along
Hmm.
Lake
Hmm.
Worth with another couple, and he was actively kind of searching or trying to see the creature. So it
Hmm.
wasn't like he was just randomly there. At, at that time there was a bunch of dudes like you and I that
Yeah.
would be out there, with um, whatever equipment you had.
Yeah.
He had a Polaroid one that shot out the picture right then and there.
Hmm.
And he said that we're driving along, and all of a sudden, the woman that he was riding with said, "Oh my God, look!" And he looks over, and Alan Plaster said this thing stood up, kind of beside the road near a tree off there in the grass,
Hmm.
and he had the wherewithal to grab that Polaroid and shoot this photo. And so that if you think about it, I mean, how this is one of the oldest alleged cryptid photos ever. The
Yeah.
Patterson
Yeah.
Gimlin film was in 1967. This is
It's
only in
2 years ago.
1969.
Hmm.
So, it's kind of a blurry, whitish looking thing and, kind of a typical Bigfootish kind of photo. But in
Yeah.
his defense, I mean, he's driving, he's using an old school Polaroid, just the fact
Polaroid.
that he even got the shot.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that's kind of carried this case and famous. However,
Hmm.
it's not
Hmm.
the only photo.
Okay.
I, for the first time, have published another photo. It was taken November the 3rd,
Before
that's
that
never
one.
been publicized, which shows kind of a similar thing by a very credible witness.
Awesome. Another reason to get the book, by the way. If anyone wants to get the book, I guess they can get it on Amazon.
Correct? Yep.
All right. And can you order any direct signed copies or anything through lyleblackburn.com like you do sometime, that kind of thing?
Right. Yeah, I do have, you can get autographed copies through me. And then of course the paperback and the Kindle book on Amazon.
Absolutely awesome. And a brand new, never before published photo, predating by a week the first photo that we all know about. Intriguing. Now, Lyle, even today, if someone were to say, look, man, I got attacked by a white thing that had horns down the road from my house, my first inclination is going to be fakery. That's just what I'm going to think immediately. Somebody said there was a Bigfoot incident. I might go think a little bit more about it. But have there ever been anyone like, the Patterson Gimlin film? There's always somebody every 10 years that claims they were the guy in the suit. Has there ever been somebody out there say, hey, I was the Lake Worth monster or anything like that?
Yes, actually, there are a lot of claims to
Yeah.
try to take credit for this.
Mm-hmm.
And, I see this a lot when people, I post something about the Lake Worth monster and people are like, that was a hoax. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
Actually, no. You
Mm-hmm.
you only see what you see on the internet. You don't know the whole story. But
Sure.
basically, the timeline, since those July sightings, there was numerous people who claimed to have seen
Mm-hmm.
an upright hairy thing. You got the
Mm-hmm.
photos, and then there's all this sort of rumors, and I see this with some cryptid cases where you don't just have one person say they
That's why
did
I brought
something.
that
You got
up.
numerous people. I'm like, well,
Everybody.
which one is it?
Yeah.
And in the case of Lake Worth, you have all sorts of weird theories from the Bobcat. There was one that this sort of like rehab center was over there, and some wild looking dude with giant feet had put on a hairy costume or something. He was there. Uh, and some other kids said they were the goat man. The police thought it was various kids from 3 different high schools. Um, and one guy, you know, came forward and said, well, he thinks he was responsible for one of the incidents. But what you have is that none of these account for how many sightings and the
Yeah.
longevity of it.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them, like one lady saying it was her brothers who were 10 and 11 years old who had rigged up bungee cords and zip lines, and they were wearing white underwear, were whizzing above cars. I'm like, no, I mean, that's
Doesn't even
just
make
no.
sense. And that's why I brought this up because it's such a weird thing. It would take me aback, like a goat guy with white thing, because you don't hear about like historical cases of that, and especially that far back with something like that. But I hate when, because something's a little extra unusual, people come out of the woodwork claiming to be the person who created that or their cousin created that, and
Mm.
you kind of kill that completely by saying that in your investigations you found it before the thing even hit the newspaper, that the police department had already been having strange accounts there.
Right. And that's usually what you find in these cases. You start really
Yeah.
digging into them, you find, well, it didn't really even start with where the newspaper publicized it.
Mhm.
And of course, I just present the story and
Sure.
the
Yeah.
information and the data as I understand it to be in a digestible chronological order. It's you know, and I'll call it as it is. And what I think is, yeah, there could have been people trying to add to this, and that happens
Yeah.
when
Mhm. Oh
crazy
yeah.
stuff's going, but it doesn't explain the mystery of it. And being that it is kind of this Goatman
Mhm.
slash Bigfoot case, you got to kind of deal with both, because Goatman in my view, is typically a folklore or urban legend situation, and usually, like I
Okay.
said, associated with bridges and other things. So I dedicate a chapter or two to looking at contrasting and comparing other Goatman legends with what we have in
Hmm.
Lake Worth, as well as
Hmm.
could it even be a Bigfoot with white hair? And I have numerous firsthand reports of people citing not only white Bigfoot-like creatures with white hair, but literally, I have reports that were in and around the general vicinity of Lake Worth within like a
Hmm.
30-mile radius, dating back as far as the 50s. And these are
Wow.
accounts that nobody's really ever tied together. But
Amazing.
again, like you said, you kind of build this whole thing where you go, hmm, well, maybe there's something going on here, and it's much bigger than just a couple of sightings that most people think of in a photo. There's way more, um, as well as the the famous book by Sally Ann Clark.
Yep. Yeah, which I have a copy of right back here somewhere in my stash of crypto books. Now, this Lake Worth monster situation, like I said, it's always been fascinating. Of course, being a Texan, you had the photo, and now we have a new photo, which I'm going to have to go get the Kindle version real quick so I can go check out. But I think it's interesting. You mentioned the white Bigfoot thing, and you went into like the folklore side of the Goatman thing. So just branching out of Lake Worth itself in that particular area, did you find any other like these goat type creature sightings anywhere within 100 miles of there?
Well, there is one that's very close. If you
Hmm.
go north from Lake Worth into the Denton area, you have what's known as the Goatman of Old Alton Bridge,
Hmm.
and that um, it's interesting that they're so close together. And the
Hmm.
Goatman of Alton Bridge is almost more of a paranormal type entity
Okay.
because it involves this sort of backstory. And usually these Goatman and bridges always have a backstory, but somebody was hung off the bridge, and then his ghost came back, and he became this goat man monster. And so these are interesting, however you put it together, that you have these tales that are very similar, especially in that so close together. One is a little
Yeah.
more paranormal, one is a little more cryptozoological,
Hmm.
but interesting. So I have that, and then of course I kind of throw in the heavy hitters, which would be the Maryland goat man
Hmm.
and the Pope Lick monster from Kentucky, who have these sort of similar stories where you have almost like you have Goatman, but you also have people claiming it was a Bigfoot. And it's super
Yeah.
interesting that you have these similarities. You just couldn't even make this stuff up. It's like they're similar in many ways, and different claims about what they may or may not be. But interesting when you look at these as a whole and think, well, ultimately, this can't all be hallucinations or people making stuff up. Even if it's a portion of the sightings are legit, we have something weird going on that we don't quite
Yeah.
understand.
No, it's intriguing, and I love the weaving in of like the white Bigfoot sightings in my book, Bigfoot South. Uh, the real inspiration for a lot of my investigation was three sightings in the same stretch of road over that. This is pre-social media, seeing a silver gray colored one, you know,
Mhm.
and then later on, when I did the reprint, someone asked me randomly if I'd ever heard of a silver gray colored Sasquatch, and it was sighted in '96 before the other reports 5 miles away. So when you have these clusters like this, you mentioned like the white Bigfoot. Let's get into a little bit of that. Are there any of these like white or lighter colored Bigfoot reports in that area that really struck you?
I think one of the best ones was, now it's a secondhand report because the guy passed
Yeah.
away, but I was
Hmm.
uh, there's this Lake Worth Monster Bash event that they do like every 5 years. And I'm
Hmm.
usually do a presentation there
Hmm.
on the history. But a woman came up and said, hey, I've never really told anybody, but my dad um, did a lot of hunting here, and he
Hmm.
was in Decatur, and you're familiar
Hmm.
with Decatur. It's kind of
Hmm.
uh, northwest of Fort Worth, not very
Yep.
far from Lake Worth. She said back in around 1950, 54, she said he came home just freaked out. And he said he was hunting and saw what he described as a big ape covered in white hair.
In white
And
hair.
she
Wow.
said, of course, 54, there's no concept of Bigfoot,
No, no.
especially here in the South. So it was just, he just described it as what he said looked like an ape. And she said, I mean, she distinctly remembers this, and he stuck to the story, and it was just he never could make sense of it. So this was prior to 1969, and I thought, wow. And this woman was very credible. She was like, "This is
Yeah.
just what my dad said," and this was way prior to that. And I thought, well, what are the chances? Like he's
Wow.
in that same area. So that was a good one. There was even ones that dated back to 1938 in
Hmm.
around Cedar Hill, which is about 30 miles from Lake Worth.
Yeah.
Another kind of unfortunately, secondhand. You're getting really
Yep.
old, but anyway, just what purpose would they have to describe it as white if it wasn't white? And
Yeah.
so those to me, build that bigger picture of this wasn't just a case of some kid swinging from a zip line in a hairy white coat. I mean, it just doesn't explain all this other stuff. So those
No,
are the
absolutely.
interesting things that when you put it all together, you kind of come to the conclusion that, well, we can explain some of this, but we can't explain all of it.
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting thing that you do in your research. And you present the facts as are, but you always end up finding things that are on the periphery of this that like people have ignored. And there's a pattern there, there's a pattern of something unusual, whether it's Boggy Creek, Momo, or now the Lake Worth monster. And were there any accounts that you heard that were, because this is dark outdoors, other than some woman being accosted by a goat man in her car? I mean, that's pretty spooky. Are there any ones that were like particularly scary, or where like someone just had something really intense happen?
Um, yeah, I include one in the book in terms of talking about the location because Lake Worth is along the Trinity River, and the
Hmm.
Trinity River starts, at least the West Fork starts above Lake Worth, and Lake Worth is
Yeah.
actually a reservoir created by damming up parts of the river.
Hmm.
So, in that sort of process of saying, well, you know, could there be, and is there something that roams along Trinity River corridor? And of course, you start zooming out and you look at that, you can find numerous sightings. So I included one just because I thought it was a pretty spooky encounter. It was also one that was along the Trinity River, much south of Dallas
Hmm.
Fort Worth. But this guy had gone out one morning to fish, and he was kind of a fisherman, and he would get
Hmm.
out there real early in the morning and get set up. And he was, no one else out there. He's sitting on the river, kind of a isolated location, and he starts, drops his line in there. He's fishing. He hears something over there in this cluster of trees keep
Hmm.
moving around, and he's like some kind of animal in there, I guess. And eventually the sun's, it's getting light, and he always looks over there, and there's this huge hair covered thing standing on two legs just right there in the trees.
Mm.
And he's out here by himself early morning, and
Yeah, man.
he said, immediately, like, what in the heck is that?
Hmm.
And he said it sort of went off back in the brush, and he's trying to deal with what this is. Should I run? I mean, I don't even know what to do. And then the thing shows itself even more, and he's just getting a good look at it, and sort of flight or fight or flight
Hmm.
mode.
Hmm.
And he said the thing looked huge, and he wasn't armed, and he's just sort of all these things that whatever preconceived notions you have of Bigfoot and other things like that, just go out the window. And he said it was just or those few moments when the thing
Mhm.
was there was just very frightening and very unnerving. Uh, of what he saw. And I try to picture myself, you and I
Yeah,
outdoors, we go fishing, and like if I was out there by myself and this thing
there he
stood.
is.
Um, and he said, luckily, it just sort of drifted off back into the woods, and then of course he just threw his stuff down and ran back to his truck. But yeah, pretty intense situations. And
Hmm.
I like those. I like the spooky aspect. I kind of just those you kind of throw out that preconceived notion of the pop culture Bigfoot. As a
Yeah,
friend of Bigfoot, or you
yeah.
see all the lunch boxes or whatever. This ain't that. This ain't that. Just imagine yourself in the woods. And there's a 7 foot tall creature. I mean, if a bear was standing there, it'd be frightening enough. But if this that looks so human and it's looking at you, you don't know what it's going to do. That's a whole nother level of spooky encounters.
Yeah, it messes with your paradigm. It's like, what in the heck is going on here? I mean, I was in Montana fly fishing and by myself in 2021 at a little public access place outside of Bozeman. I kind of picked it because I figured it was grizzly safe, but I thought I might run into a moose, maybe. But and I hear this, and I'm down on this bank, and it's this tall bank, and I see this flash of like grayish and brown run past me twice in the bushes, and there. I don't have a gun. I just flew from Texas. Then all of a sudden, about 15 seconds later, I feel something brush against my leg, and I think, "It's it, Lord, take me." And I look, and it must be a 15-year-old standard poodle, you know. And it was just someone, and I hear some guy hollering. His poodle got loose off this trail, but thank God it was a poodle, it wasn't a grizzly. Is what I was thinking.
Yeah, yeah.
And but it was that unexpected thing, and it was just that grunt in the bushes. So I can't imagine looking over and going, "Hi, Mr. Sasquatch," or whatever you are. I'm terrified right now. I mean, that would be really, really intense. And you brought up something good here about the Bigfoot thing. There seems to be, as we know, different camps of people who think these things are real. And some of them tend to think they are just, out there strumming an acoustic guitar, singing folk music, peace, we love you, brother. And then there are other folks who've had these encounters that maybe are really terrifying or maybe even violent. And it seems like in this I guess we call it cryptozoology episode of the Goatman of Greer Island, of the Lake Worth monster here. You kind of have both things going on. You have something violent and creepy, and then you kind of seem to have some more standard type, just crossing the road type sightings.
Right. Yeah. You kind of got it all. And it, you know, starts out, with this sort of scary encounter of it jumping on
Yeah.
the car. And then, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
you've got it running around and you got all these people chasing it and, photos. Um, that seems to be the cross section of all of this. Some encounters, the creatures are aggressive and display, maybe for territorial reasons or whatever. And then other times they're just very shadowy. So the bottom line is they seem unpredictable.
Mm-hmm.
If these creatures exist, I don't think you can count on any one scenario in an encounter,
Yeah.
and especially just these cases, and they kind of compare to like maybe even like Legend of Boggy Creek. I mean, it's sort of what first got in the paper for that was the Ford family who
Mm-hmm.
uh, was in a house and something, was coming around night after night and eventually attacked one of the guys there. So that's what got in the paper. And then same kind of thing. You start piecing together all these encounters after that and before
Mm-hmm.
that. They weren't all attacks, but yeah, these kind of things are similar in a lot of ways. Kind of there is a consistency.
What I tell people about this Bigfoot phenomenon in terms of like safety, if these things are real, there are people who will say, "Oh, they're all peaceful. I believe them and they're peaceful." Well, not all humans are peaceful. Not all known primates are peaceful. Not all bears. I've had wild boars that I walked up and I was 5 feet from them when I noticed them and they spooked off and ran. And then I had another one that saw me from 20 feet away and just charged me. Thank God I had a tree to shuck up, but so it seems to be that if it's a living creature, they're going to have all kinds of behavior and responses to encountering with us and things like that. So I like the fact you just cover it and show what happens, let people make up their own decisions. Now, in terms of just linear time here, when was the last time that there was a sighting that you feel was, legitimately someone saw something strange and in the Lake Worth area?
Right. Well, if you're talking just pure visual sightings,
Yeah.
it really only went into the next year in which
Okay.
you had some, eyewitnesses saying they'd seen stuff. Beyond that, um, into the 70s, mid 70s even, you had some people claiming they heard eerie howls.
Mhm.
There's been footprints and other kind of
Mhm.
residual things reported on into there, and even some other weird stuff. I got contacted actually on YouTube when my podcast Monster Bizarro. I did a Lake Worth monster, and some guy told me about some really weird encounter out there that he and his buddies had in the 70s. So you had a continued, um, you know, strangeness going on with incidents, but as a whole, it seemed like the reports were there, and then the thing perhaps moved on, and that's kind of typical of river sightings. I mean,
Mhm.
obviously, it may or may not have lived there. People theorized it lived on Greer Island. That was the thing. It was even seen jumping in the water and swimming over there, which is kind of weird, not
Mhm.
typical ape behavior if it was ape, any sort of related to an ape. But um, so yeah, it was just sort of that thing where it just a big bunch of stuff, and then it sort of dissipates. And of course, people asked all the time, "Oh man, has there been recent sightings?" But it is just so much more developed out there. I mean, it is not like it was back in 1969, where most of that was just rural or definitely just woods. You still
Yeah.
have the area of Greer Island, and that um, it was a nature refuge back in that
Mhm.
time already. It had been set aside as public land, and
Mhm.
now uh, it's the Fort Worth Nature Center, which they have buffaloes out there and all sorts of
Cool.
wildlife, and you can canoe on the river. And it still looks very, very wild. And Greer Island still looks exactly like it is now. There's actually a footbridge to it, whereas back then you couldn't get there without a boat or swimming. So it's very much more populated. So I don't find it surprising that it's not like something
Right.
that's ongoing, like not like in say Falk or Legend of Boggy Creek, where the Sulphur River bottoms literally still look like they did back in the 70s. This is a
Yeah.
situation where, wow, this is, or Dallas is so like a metropolis of cities and population, that this actually at one time, this monster thing could have very well been running around out there. Um, had already been set aside, which is great because we still have
Yeah.
places where you know families can visit, kids
Yeah,
visit, and
man.
doing the kind of things that we love is where kids get out in the outdoors. So luckily they've preserved that all these years and have not developed that, which is even greater because when you go and stand right there at the end of Shoreline Road, right at Greer Island, you're literally standing right where Miss Reichert was sitting in that car, and all that stuff went down, and you can still see the what's known as the pit where that cliff is, where the creature was said to have run across up there and thrown the
Mhm.
tire. Still there. You can see that to this day. And we've even gone up there several years ago and tried to recreate the tire toss,
Hmm.
and just to see how far you could throw or do something. And I'm not even the only one. Our colleague Jim Whitehead was telling me, "Oh yeah, we tried to do the tire toss as well," and no one can get it to go more than about 15 feet or 30 feet. And the witnesses who were there that night claimed that it flew 400 or 500 feet across that meadow, which was another just totally
Wow.
crazy thing because you cannot throw a tire. So maybe that
Yeah.
lends itself to something uh, not normal, doesn't have an average explanation as to how that
Yeah.
happened, if that's what happened.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's still there. And they even have a little sign there now at Greer Island. Tells you about the different species of birds and trees and other things. And they say it has a thing, it calls it a mythological wildlife, which,
Mythological wildlife. Okay.
eh,
Well, the cool thing is there's a conservation of this area there. It's great to see that. I always try to promote the conservation of land and wildlife resources. And good that people that are into this stuff can go out to one of the historical sites. And if you're in Texas, I mean, you're in Dallas, Fort Worth, go check it out. I mean, a cool thing. And make sure and go get my good friend Lyle Blackburn's book or books if you haven't checked out his other stuff. You can get them on Amazon. You got the Lake Worth, and just look up Lyle Blackburn. His stuff will pop up. And where else can people contact you? You mentioned Monstro Bizarro. I mean, what's going on with that?
that's my podcast
Yeah.
called Monstro Bizarro, and that's available on all the podcast platforms.
Yeah.
So people can check that out. And I do have a Lake Worth Monster episode that I did prior to the book. That was the first episode. So I've learned a lot since then. So the book,
Mm-hmm.
and I got like 40 pictures in the book. You can see
Mm-hmm.
a lot of things um, that have never been published. And yeah, at lyleblackburn.com, it's got links to all that.
Awesome stuff, man. And follow you on social media. Always have interesting stuff to post. And just thanks for coming on to Dark Outdoors.
Absolutely. Thank you.
If you would like to share your dark outdoor story, email chester@chestermore.com. If you would like a PDF file of my personal survival tips, put survival in the subject line. Read my wildlife writings and follow my Higher Calling Wildlife and Higher Calling Gulf Coast podcast at highercalling.net. Remember, never enter the wild without prayer and preparation.